about September 11th, 2001. Instead, let's ask ourselves one question. What was 9/11? A terrorist atrocity? An attack on America? The first salvo in a new war? A day that changed everything? The question may seem simple, but how we answer it is of vital importance. It determines how we proceed with our investigation of that day. And once you strip away the emotional rhetoric and the fear-inducing imagery, we're left with the simple truth. 9/11 was a crime. And as with any crime, there is one overriding imperative that detectives must follow to identify the perpetrators. Follow the money. This is an investigation of the 9/11 money trail. To privatize the World Trade Center, the complex of office towers in Lower Manhattan that they had owned and operated since their construction in 1973. In April 2001, an agreement was reached with a consortium of investors led by Silverstein Properties, and on July 24, 2001, Larry Silverstein, who already owned World Trade Center Building 7, signed a 99-year lease for the Twin Towers and Buildings 4 and 5. The lease was for $3.2 billion and was financed by a bridge loan from GMAC, the commercial mortgage arm of General Motors, as well as $111 million from Lloyd Goldman and Joseph Kerr, individual real estate investors. Silverstein Properties only put down $14 million of its own money. The deal was unusual in a variety of ways. Although the Port Authority carried only $1.5 billion of insurance coverage on the WTC complex, which earlier that year had been valued at $1.2 billion, Silverstein had insisted on doubling that amount, insuring the buildings for $3.55 billion. Silverstein's insurance broker struggled to put that much coverage in place and ultimately had to split it among 25 dealers. The negotiations were so involved that only temporary contracts were in place for the insurance at the time the lease was signed, and by September the contracts were still being finalized. Silverstein's group was also explicitly given the right to rebuild the structures if they were destroyed, and even to expand the amount of retail space on the site if rebuilding did take place. Within hours of the destruction of the Twin Towers on September 11th, Silverstein was on the phone to his lawyers, trying to determine if his insurance policies could construe the attacks as two separate insurable incidents rather than one. 11th, Silverstein was on the phone to his lawyers, trying to determine if his insurance policies could construe the attacks as two separate insurable incidents rather than one. Silverstein spent years in the courts attempting to win $7.1 billion from his $3.55 billion insurance policy, and in 2007 walked away with $4.55 billion, the largest single insurance settlement ever. As soon as the deal was announced, Silverstein sued United and American Airlines for a further $3.5 billion for their negligence in the 9/11 attacks, a claim that was struck down by the courts but is still on appeal. Perhaps even more outrageously, in a secret deal in 2003, the Port Authority agreed to pay back 80% of their initial equity in the lease, but allowed the Silverstein Group to maintain control of the site. The deal gave Silverstein, Goldman, and Kerr $98 million of the $125 million they put down on the lease, and a further $130 million in insurance proceeds that were earmarked for the site's rebuilding. In the end, Silverstein profited from the 9/11 attacks to the tune of $4.5 billion and counting. But that's the 9/11 insurance heist you saw. There was a much deeper, more complex, and well-hidden heist that was taking place behind closed doors on September 11th, 2001, deep in the heart of the World Trade Center itself. Marsh & McLennan is a diversified risk, insurance, and professional services firm with over $13 billion in annual revenue and 57,000 employees. In September of 2001, 2,000 of those employees worked in Marsh's offices in the World Trade Center. Marsh occupied floors 93 to 100 of the North Tower, the exact area of the impact and explosion. In the year prior to 9/11, Marsh had contracted with Silverstream Software to create an electronic connection between Marsh and its clients for the purpose of creating paperless transactions. Silverstream had already built internet-based transactional and trading platforms for Merrill Lynch, Deutsche Bank, Bankers Trust, Alex Brown, Morgan Stanley, and other financial services firms that were later involved in 9/11, but this new project was unlike anything that had been attempted before. Richard Andrew Grove, the salesperson who handled the Marsh & McLennan project for Silverstream, explains.
2000, Silverstream was contracted by Marsh to provide a technological solution beyond what we had done for any of the above-named companies insofar as it will be used to electronically connect Marsh to its major business partners via internet portals for the purpose of creating paperless transactions and expediting revenue and renewal cycles, and built from the ground up at the client's site. Silverstream provided a specific type of connectivity that was used to link AIG and Marsh & McLennan, the first two commercial companies on the planet to employ this specific type of transaction, and in fact, Marsh was presented with something called the Accord Award, ACORD, in the summer of 2001 for being the first commercial corporation to do so. And what you should take away from that is this. It means that no other companies were doing this type of transaction, so the question in your mind should be, what then were Marsh and AIG doing, and why did they need to leverage technologies that no other commercial entity on the face of the earth needed to conduct business? The contract, Silverstream then stationed approximately 30 to 40 developers at Marsh, and this team was led by 2 to 3 managers with whom I liaised to ensure delivery of the solution that was promised. The development team worked regularly into the night, if not all night, and sometimes worked 7 days a week in order to adhere to Marsh's indicated pre-September 11th deadline. Now, while I was...
But it was not long before severe irregularities in the billing of the account for this project led Richard Grove into the heart of a deeper mystery about the software and about the work that he was engaged in.
Fiscal anomalies with respect to the Marsh.com project when I was in a meeting on the 98th floor in October of 2000 with a gentleman named Gary Lasko. Gary was Marsh's North American Chief Information Officer, and that particular afternoon a colleague and I helped him identify about $10 million in suspicious purchase orders after I had recognized that certain vendors were deceiving Marsh and specifically appeared to be selling Marsh large quantities of hardware that were not necessary, as this was later confirmed by Gary. In the spring of 2000, I brought my concerns up to executives inside of Silverstream and I was urged to keep quiet and mind my own business. I went to an executive inside of Marsh, and he advised me this was later confirmed by Gary. In the spring of 2000, I brought my concerns up to executives inside of Silverstream and I was urged to keep quiet and mind my own business. I went to an executive inside of Marsh, and he advised me to do likewise. But then, I mentioned it to a few executives at Marsh who I could trust, like Gary Lasko, and Catherine Lee, Ken Rice, Richard Bruhart, and John Olthofer, people who became likewise concerned that something untoward was going on. The concerned colleagues I just mentioned were murdered on September 11th, and the executives who expressed dismay at my concerns are alive and free today because of it. Were murdered on September 11th, and the executives who expressed dismay at my concerns are alive and free today because of it. I feel it's no coincidence as the Marsh executive who urged me to drop my line of inquiry made sure that his personnel, who I just mentioned, were in the office bright and early for a global conference call before the staff meeting upon which I was to intrude. A conference call which I was informed this executive in question conducted but attended from the safety of his Upper West Side apartment, upon which I was to intrude. A conference call which I was informed this executive in question conducted, but attended from the safety of his Upper West Side apartment. Although in getting...
The global conference call with Marsh's IT staff on the morning of 9/11, a meeting that included the staff who were investigating the suspicious billing on the Silverstream deal, was confirmed in a 2006 interview with Marsh's then Chief Information Officer, Ellen Clark. Richard Grove had been asked to attend the meeting, but was stuck in traffic on the way to the towers when the attack began. His friends at Marsh were not so lucky. 294 Marsh employees, including all of the participants in the conference call in the North Tower, died that morning. Meanwhile, the Marsh executive who had scheduled the meeting, the same one who had asked Grove to drop the issue of the billing anomalies, was safe in his apartment, attending the meeting via telephone. So,
Andy!
Get out!
Listen to me!
Get out of my room! Okay?
No! That is not okay, Andy!
Jesse Ventura never shies away from a fight, not as a Navy SEAL, bodyguard for the Rolling Stones, pro wrestler, or as governor of Minnesota. And he's picking plenty more with his new book, 63 Documents the Government Does Not Want You to Read. Welcome back, Jesse Ventura. And I do promise, you do not have to follow Chris Rock the next time you're on the show.
Thank you, George. He is a tough act to have to follow. What a funny guy.
He is a very funny guy. But let's get right
Sure.
to it, because we talked about this a little bit your last time on the show as well. This whole idea that you have some documents which you say at least reinforce the idea that the government had advanced knowledge that 9/11 could happen.
Absolutely.
And didn't work to stop it. Now, I find a hard time believing you actually believe that.
Why? I'm a Vietnam veteran, and they lied to me about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and that was the false flag operation that put us into the Vietnam War, where 58,000 of my generation were killed. And now I was teaching at Harvard when McNamara came through and admitted it never happened. False flag operations, if you go through history, happen all the time before these wars.
But that's very different from saying that the government knew 9/11 was coming, knew the planes were coming, and didn't try to stop it.
Well, take a look at my book. It's no more shocking than our government going down to Nicaragua and infecting hundreds of people with syphilis to see if penicillin worked. George, let me state this. There are great people that work in government. There are dedicated, patriotic people in government. But when you read this book, the scary part of this book for me, you could substitute the word Nazi and it would work.
But the documents you use on
government. There are dedicated, patriotic people in government. But when you read this book, the scary part of this book for me, you could substitute the word Nazi and it would work.
But the documents you use on 9/11 show, there's one document that suggests that Tower 7 fell down faster than it could have fallen down just by natural.
It doesn't suggest it, it says it. It said it fell at, NIST report said it fell at free fall.
So then you make the
wait a
leap
minute. That means you got to defy the laws of physics. That means everything was removed in which for anything to fall at free fall
speed. But then you make that
speed.
leap then to the idea that it was demolished by explosives inside by the government.
I don't make a leap. Why didn't they check for explosives? They never did, if not to eliminate them. They didn't do that. This book is all documents that are out in the public domain. I'm not WikiLeaks. I didn't steal anything. You just got to find them. And there are documents here so disturbing, like the CIA's assassination manual. Excuse me, assassination is just a nice word for first-degree murder, and we have a manual that tells how to do it and everything about it. As far as I know, George, first-degree murder is illegal in every country in the world.
But aren't there some cases where it would be justified, a tyrant who's killing hundreds of thousands of people?
Who makes the call? I'll say this, too, about if we go back to bin Laden, why haven't we?
Aren't there some cases where it would be justified, a tyrant who's killing hundreds of thousands of people?
Who makes the call? I'll say this, too, about if we go back to bin Laden, why haven't we indicted him? That gives us reason to go get him. We haven't indicted him. The government has never come forward, convened a grand jury, presented one shred of evidence that he did it officially, and get an indictment.
So you don't believe he was behind it either?
I don't know. But my government's lied to me so often, they've lost their credibility with me, George.
And you do have the documents you say support some of these theories in the book.
And the good thing about this book, it's not me telling you about the documents. I give you my opinion, but then we reprint every document so the reader can read for themselves.
I want to switch gears right now. You've had such a varied career. You're even once on a soap opera, Young and Restless.
I've got a bone to pick.
Canisters on each side of the ship. Even though they were being shot at, the Liberty crew eventually put out the fires. After a brief lull, 3 torpedo boats arrived, strafing the ship with their 40mm cannon and 50mm machine guns. Then they proceeded to drop their torpedoes in the water. One finally did find its mark. Our skipper passed a command to prepare to abandon ship. 3 inflatable life rafts that remained seaworthy were dropped over the side and were machine gunned by the motor torpedo boats. Our life vests were now our only hope for survival, and the more seriously wounded would never survive. However, the engine room was able to bring the boilers back to life, and the Liberty had power. In addition, damage control indicated that the ship stopped taking on water, and the ship came to a 9-degree list to starboard. So our captain wisely decided not to abandon ship. About that time, Israeli helicopters hovered near the ship and repel boarders were ordered. However, for whatever reason, their attack was called off and all hostilities ceased. I personally risked going topside to ascertain what was happening and saw 2 Israeli helicopters carrying armed Marines. The USS Liberty is currently the most decorated U.S. Navy ship for a single engagement. There were 208 Purple Hearts given alone. The military does not award Purple Hearts, Medal of Honor, Navy Crosses, Silver or Bronze Stars for mere accidents. But that is exactly what the Johnson administration attempted to call it initially. In order to secure the Jewish vote for upcoming elections, they could not have Israel taken to task. This was a major historical event. Any other time, their action would have been an act of war. The event had to be buried quickly, quietly, and without fanfare. Therefore, a couple of actions were taken immediately. The Navy told the Liberty survivors never to talk about the attack to anyone, including our families, or face a $10,000 fine or 10 years imprisonment. The Navy told the Liberty survivors never to talk about the attack to anyone, including our families, or face a $10,000 fine or 10 years imprisonment.
In the days after the September attacks, there were countless rumors about strange coincidences.
Deal of time examining this question. It does not appear that they were in place taking pictures before the planes hit, but shortly thereafter. And they say they haven't uncovered evidence that any of these 5 men, and they did their backgrounds, they searched apartments, they telephone records and so on, had any advanced knowledge of the attack.
And while the FBI or certain sources might believe that in fact they were Israeli intelligence, they don't believe that the U.S. was a target, that they were actually investigating Muslim groups.
They believe if this was an intelligence operation by Israel, that it was focused on the Islamic groups and charities that raise money for groups that are considered by U.S. law enforcement and others terrorist groups. And you'll note that after September 11th, the U.S. moved on many of these groups with indictments, arrests, raids on their headquarters, something that hadn't happened prior to this.
These are groups that Israel believes have been funding Hamas and other terrorist organizations.
Groups that are responsible for most of the suicide bombings there.
All right, John Miller will have a full report. You can see it tonight on 2020 at 10 o'clock Eastern.
5 men had advanced knowledge of the September 11th plot. After 6 men have been barred from returning to the United States for 10 years, they say because
The Navy told the Liberty survivors never to talk about the attack to anyone, including our families, or face a $10,000 fine or 10 years imprisonment.
10 years, they say, because they among both U.S. and Israeli officials. According to federal officials, the 5 men have been barred from returning to the United States for 10 years.
The Navy told the Liberty survivors never to talk about the attack to anyone, including our families, or face a $10,000 fine or 10 years imprisonment.